Данная эти русские революции должна будет...
Если немцы хотят не истребительную войну, они ее получат.
La lucha armada es el único camino para la liberación.
Patria o muerte.
Les Américains se trompent en croyant qu'en bombardant le Nord, ils pourront gagner la guerre dans le Sud.
Il y en a qui demandent mais où se trouve l'impérialisme. L'impérialisme, regardez dans vos assiettes. Quand vous mangez, les grains de...
Repressing people of color all over the world and on a local level, the police, fascist police, repressing the white revolutionaries as well as the black.
And the reason that this class over here has never did anything to get this class off his back because this is lower, this is upper, this is the oppressed, this is the oppressed.
You asking me to confess to something?
Ayer estuvo el diablo aquí, huele a azufre todavía.
And the cheap labor taken out of these countries are not underdeveloped, they're overexploited.
You're listening to Revolutionary Lumpen Radio. In this episode we are rejoined by our beloved comrades Tara and Malik, where we go into a very informative deep dive on the Comprador Class, a class not spoken about enough, so I'm just going to go ahead and dive right into it for you. I love doing this work, I think it's super important, so if you would like to support us, you can do so for free by subscribing on your podcast player, rating us on Apple Podcasts for example, or Spotify. Another way to help us out that is completely free to do is just share this episode with a friend. If you do want more and you want to support us financially to increase our workload at a higher quality, please support us on Patreon at patreon.com/lumpenpodcast.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Alec, do you want to go first?
No, after you.
Okay, my name is Tara. I'm from Palestine. I'm from occupied Jerusalem and occupied Jaffa. So I'm located in Geojage, which is known as Montreal on Turtle Island. My family was exiled from Palestine in 1948, and so I'm a Palestinian exile. And right now I'm a student, and I do some organizing, community organizing, and some mutual aid work at home.
Awesome. I'm Malik. I'm from Britain and Senegal, spent time in both nations, a few years in Burkina Faso. I run the Ministry of African Propaganda, where I plan on doing 1,000 quotes from Africans I love, both from the continent and the diaspora. I'm doing a PhD on the Black radical tradition in West Africa, particularly Ghana, looking at the anti-colonial nationalist movement, looking at Nkrumah dialectically with the Black masses and how both developed one another's ideas. And yeah, I'm very happy to be back on Rev Lumpen Radio. This is my favorite podcast, my favorite source of good conversation. So yeah, I look forward to this particular topic as well.
Thank you very much for coming back on the show, Tara, and thank you very much for all the work that you do in terms of organising and fundraising. You do have a pretty jealousy-inducing following on Twitter and Instagram, but what I really love about you is you use that following for fundraising and raising awareness to some of the most important shit on the planet. Comrade Malik, again, thank you so much for coming back on the show. It's always a pleasure. What I love about you is you're doing a PhD in Black radicals in Africa, whilst also, ironically, being a Black radical in Africa. Your capacity for knowledge and teaching is outstanding, and I always think about that when I see more of your quotes, that those quotes have come from serious research. Love that. So the Comprador Class. Tara, you're an expert in Palestine, so you're going to speak about your experience or your understanding of the Comprador Class in Palestine. And of course, we've also got Malik here with all their understanding of African history and class struggles. I'm going to speak a little about the pig class because it's from the Imperial Corps, and obviously that's all I know. I'd like to know more, so why don't we get into it now?
Floor's yours.
Okay, so last time I was talking with Shibi on this podcast, I mentioned the Palestinian Comprador Class in reference to the Palestinian Authority. And we spoke about how important it is to understand that class and their role in hindering our liberation. I sort of explained it like super briefly back then, but just to give like my understanding of the Comprador class, according to Chairman Mao, and in relation to Palestine, it's the part of the national bourgeoisie that essentially gives up on the national liberation struggle and sort of becomes the lackeys of the imperialists without really any state power. And so in Palestine, it's called the Palestinian Authority, but it's kind of a misnomer because it's not like they have authority over anything. They're the comprador class. They don't really own any means of production, like under colonialism in Palestine. The means of production are obviously owned by the settler colonial bourgeoisie. And so even in their function as like a bourgeois class, they don't own the modes of production in the way that the bourgeoisie in another class society would. And that's because in Palestine, the main contradiction is settler colonialism and imperialism. It's not the class antagonism. And so that's how their role kind of develops, to where they kind of form a puppet regime type of class within the bourgeoisie. And yeah, like I mentioned, in Palestine, this is embodied within the Palestinian Authority, which was formed in 1993, where the Oslo Accords were signed and the Palestine Liberation Organization sort of accepted the so-called peace process, where quote-unquote two-state solution is the goal of the outcome of that peace process. And from that came the Palestinian Authority, composed of the Palestinian Comprador class.
Wowza. Yeah, I'll go next actually on that. So the first time I heard about it, I think that I'm conscious of anyway, was on that episode where you mentioned it, like you said, and like I was automatically interested because it was a class that I'd never heard of before, and I feel like as a Marxist, as like a historical materialist, I feel like it's my duty and responsibility to understand all classes. So to think that there's a class out there that I don't know means that I don't know how institutions and systems and bureaucracies and monopolies of violence that prop up this state or settle a colonial state. It's like I'm missing insight into how that works because I'm failing to see the individuals who are doing it, and those individuals express themselves with a form of class consciousness that's been identified with the Comprador class. I mean, this is as it turns out now, and I'm happy to go more into this through the episode, but at the time when you mentioned it and I was getting back in touch with you, I was like, yeah, let's talk about the Commodore class, and I was like totally saying it wrong and spelling it wrong. I did not have a clue, do you know what I mean? Like I couldn't even spell it. So, and it's been on my mind ever since. So I'm so excited to dive into this for those reasons. And also, again, as a reminder to everybody else, again, that it is our duty to look at like classes, and this is why I'm happy again that this is an opportunity to look at how the imperial core, because okay, look, I'm just gonna go off a little bit, but like when we talk about the Palestinian Authority not having this actual authority but claiming that it does, like where does that come from? Do you know what I mean? Like this comes from the positions of power, those with the monopoly of violence. It ultimately can probably be traced down to the imperial core. So it's important to look at this class because I had never heard of it. Marx and Lenin never wrote about it. So I think that there's a good chance that like most European Marxists don't know about it, but it's still a main instrument in colonialism. So for those reasons, that's why I'm so happy to hopefully come away with this is not only being able to spell it, but maybe being able to explain it to people after this. Malik, comrade.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's a great conversation. It's a great topic, and it's interesting to see it from, I guess the perspectives of both Palestine and the African continent. I don't want to draw parallels between the two because obviously they're, very different. Palestine's under direct occupation, whereas, the part of Africa where I was born and where I've lived in, we didn't have that direct occupation, right? So I don't really want to compare the two for those reasons, but in many regards, like there's still so many similarities. The same way the Palestinian Authority almost acts as a smokescreen and can really detract from grounded resistance in Palestine. We see a lot of similarities, in various parts of the continent where the national bourgeoisie and this comprador class can use this jingoistic language, right? They can use this language of resistance, this language of fighting colonialism, fighting racial capitalism, but they're not the ones actually fighting it, and moreover, they're not the ones even suffering. Right? They're not the ones even suffering its most violent forms and impacts. And yeah, I guess the first way in which I came across the Comprador class was I was doing reading about post-colonial, decolonial studies. This was the first time when I really wanted to learn about what I saw and what I experienced and what I lived in and through on the continent. I wanted to understand why it was that, I never saw, for example, I never saw a poor white man on the continent. I wanted to know why we had, some people who looked like me and they were rich and they were, our leaders. They were our business owners, our political and economic leadership. And they had all this money whilst, next door to them, we had people living in rags, right? People living in, just total extreme poverty. I wanted to understand all of these things. And through post-colonial studies, I really was first introduced to the term comprador. And for me, it really described it for me. It really gave me, I guess, a term that I could use to describe this class, right? This class of rulers who, had political and economic power whilst the masses of the people still struggled through day-to-day lives. But eventually, when I came into Marxism, then I realized actually, no, it's not just about having compradors. We need to be able to link this to, we need to be able to think about their relationship to the capital that creates the poverty in the countries that I lived in, right? We need to be able to not only identify them as compradors and, fake leadership, but also people who actually maintain the neocolonial state of affairs, people who maintain the exploitation of child labor, let's say. Do you get what I'm trying to say? I came through it through post-colonial studies, and then through Marxism, I was able to connect it to, I guess, a better theory of struggle, right? That helped me understand them a lot better.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, we all know here that Marxism is like a science, and it's a science that can be applied differently to different material conditions, and that's why dialectical materialism is so important. And you mentioned a really important word, which is neocolonial. This class, and this is part of the similarities that we can draw between Africa, the African continent, and Palestine, where this class acts in a neocolonial capacity, perpetuates neoliberalism also. This is happening in the West Bank in Palestine, where families that are part of the Comprador class, that are very heavily involved in state affairs or the state apparatus of the Palestinian Authority, are developing, gentrified towns, new gentrified cities. So they have this material impact on their own people that they've betrayed for their class interests and their social interests. Of course, at the cost of just handing over their land and their liberty to the colonizer.
Definitely, 100%. And I mean, I personally notice how education is a huge part of that, right? We see with this class, they're all educated in Western schools where the goal isn't to liberate their own, the goal isn't to even understand their own culture. Really, in my opinion, the goal is to run away from their own culture and to run away from local knowledge and to try and replicate the West as much as possible, right? Like that's what I noticed, at least on the African continent. And I think Fanon writes a lot about this, right? About how, you know, the national bourgeoisie does exactly that. They're just running and trying to really do the West in blackface on the African continent, at least in the African context. They're doing the West in blackface, and with that comes exploitation, right? With that comes exploitation of local land, local labor, local resource wealth. And I guess as a middle stratum class, they benefit from that, right? They stand to benefit from that. As you mentioned, this is their exact neo-colonial function. This is the purpose of their class. These are their class interests. For me, it's a shame that I think many on the continent increasingly are starting to see this, but this still seems to be the biggest problem. We're not seeing how it is many amongst our own who are perpetuating this abuse. It is many amongst our own who are perpetuating this exploitation. It's very easy to look at the West. It's very easy to look at, you know, powers in the imperial core and, you know, to rightly blame them for the misery and chaos that they perpetuate. It's very easy to do that, but it's a lot harder to look at, you know, these classes who are living right next to us, right? Who are living amongst us, who look exactly like us. Like that's the harder thing to do. And obviously, you know, things are getting better on the continent from what I'm seeing, but I mean, what I'm hearing as well, it's still a problem. It still seems to be the biggest hurdle in the African context. I don't know if it's the same in the Palestinian struggle.
Yeah, it's a bit different, I would say, like on the ground versus in exile. In Palestine, the Palestinian Authority, for the most part, is very much recognized as, maybe not with the same vocabulary, but the Comprador Class, like the traitors. They arrest the same people that the Zionist entity are looking for. They enact nitrates and allow and facilitate IOF, so like Israeli occupation forces, their nitrates. They even assassinate Palestinians like Nizar Banat last year, who was beaten to death and who was extremely critical and opposed to the Palestinian Authority. And, you know, so on the ground, like even when we talk about Gaza, which is, as you know, like under a land, air, and sea blockade and has been for almost 20 years, there, you know, they have a different leadership. And so their leadership is very much open about how the national bourgeoisie in the West Bank has like abandoned the goal of Palestinian liberation, absolute Palestinian liberation, not Palestinian liberation with conditions, not Palestinian liberation at like 5% or 50%. But then you go in the diaspora, which is where I lived, still really close to the region, you know, which is kind of funny because, you know, all of these arbitrary borders were drawn in 1917, like or 1916, the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and so we were exiled to Jordan, which is just a few hour drive away from Palestine. And so there, the reality was very much different. Like I grew up in a bourgeois Palestinian family. When we were exiled, there was no downward class mobility. And so, like you mentioned, I was educated in international schools, like with the IB, International Baccalaureate Program, you know, all of these things. We had a book that literally cited a picture with the caption, Palestinian terrorists. And that's in Jordan, where 50% of the population is Palestinians in exile who are refused the right to return. And we know that in Jordan, the royal family is very closely tied to the US, very heavily involved in facilitating US imperialism and interventionism in the region. And this is something that's been pointed out for decades, you know, like
now recording.
Oh no, did you forget to record?
No, because I've got two things recording. I've got my Bandicam
okay, that's
and
good. No, that's okay. I was like, no, it's such a good conversation.
Yeah. No, we still got it. But this has got a higher quality, sorry.
Okay.
Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's okay. I was like, no, it's such a good conversation.
Yeah. No, we still got it.
Okay, wait, what was I gonna say? Yeah, this has been known for decades when the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, the PFLP, wrote about this in their first statement and in the Strategy for the Liberation of Palestine, that the Jordanian royal family for decades has been facilitating imperialism in the region, not just, covertly, but also by literally kicking out the PLO, like forcing their headquarters to move to Lebanon and during the 1967 war. And so we have this different reality in Jordan, and I'm sure like in other areas around Palestine, like Syria, Lebanon. Obviously, the Gulf is a completely different like situation with completely different interests. But the reason I'm mentioning this is because the state and the state apparatus in Jordan and countries that are like it, where there does exist a portion of the Palestinian bourgeoisie in exile in those regions that are naturalized as, for example, Jordanian citizens, like we were, for example. And some of those are, heavily supportive of, for example, armed resistance, or, repeat all these slogans about freedom and liberation and free Palestine and everything. But then you look at the material conditions and there's a Zionist embassy in your country, right? It's like right across the street from where you where you live or where you go shopping or where your friends live. And so we also need to recognize that there is a portion of the Palestinian bourgeoisie outside of Palestine in the diaspora that does play a role that's not very similar to the Comprador class on the ground, but sort of, like you said, acts like a smokescreen, so to speak.
Yeah, that makes sense. But I guess I mean, I have a question on that. The question is because I know in the African context, the imperial powers tend to take one ethnic group to prop up as the national bourgeoisie and as the comprador class. And I know that I've got a friend from Lebanon whose grandmother is Palestinian. And so I've learned a bit about Lebanon from him. And I know that in Lebanon, things are quite sectarian, right? Like along religious lines. And correct me if I'm wrong, I'm going to have to be corrected here for sure. But from what I gather, Lebanese Christians especially were propped up as a comprador class and as a almost like a national ruling class by Israel and by Western powers, from what I understand. Is there a similar thing in Palestine as well? Is there perhaps a particular religious, I don't know, religious or ethnic? Is it divided along any lines like that, as it is in the African context or over in Lebanon?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Lebanon is a very specific and also interesting case in that it's not super similar to how it is around, like, for example, in Syria or in Jordan or in Palestine. And yes, like you're absolutely right. The Christian right in Lebanon, the Phalangists, were funded by the Zionist entity, funded by the US to even carry out massacres in Palestinian refugee camps in Lebanon. But that's a very different, even though, like I mentioned, they're so close in proximity, like just in terms of the geography and the location. It's a very different situation from in Palestine or other areas in the Levant in terms of like sectarianism. I would say that the only sort of propping up, so to speak, of an ethnic minority that the Zionist entity participates in is the involvement of the Druze in the Israeli occupation forces. And so they are a minority, but they are, for the most part, completely aligned with the Zionist entity to the point of joining the army, enacting the colonial violence through the army. And so that's the only parallel I think that I can draw as far as I know. But yeah, Lebanon is a very, very interesting and different case for such a super small region. But yeah, the sectarianism there is intense.
So we're here to try and hit the term Comprador Class on the head, what it means, what it says about an individual and the consciousness, the position in society in relation to the means of production and social mobility. So obviously we're all going to have slightly different views on what it is, and I think that's great. So why don't we talk about it more and try and get more of an at least accurate or more versatile understanding of the word?
Sure. So I've two definitions of this. I'm going to go at this from both, I guess, a West African perspective, as I saw the Comprador class there, and the perspective that I've seen in West London, where I spent a significant portion of my childhood as well. And I was telling you this, the West London one. So
you were just like, so yeah, do you know what this is? And I'm just like, what?
Compradors, if I was speaking to my friends, if I was speaking to just any normal person on the street, right? Like they would refer to compradors as something called a coon, right? I was explaining to you what a coon is. It's very hard to describe it in nice terms. It's not a word you should use. It's not a word you should use, and you definitely shouldn't describe particular politicians as a coon unless you want to get in a lot of trouble. Yeah, so coon, another word for coon is a coconut. The, the reason why they use the word coconut is because they are black or brown on the outside and white on the inside. And now that's not just a racial thing, right? That's also to do with class interests. I won't name it. I won't name this politician. I don't want to bring any trouble here, but there's a particular UK politician who's of an ethnic minority background. And a lot of friends I know, a lot of people from where I grew up in West London, they call him a coon. They call him a coconut. What they mean is comprador, right? This is the same thing, right? It describes the same function. This is someone whose interests, whose class and material interests are aligned with the establishment. They are aligned with the bourgeoisie. They are not aligned with their community, whether it's a racial community or an economic community. So that's a definition of a comprador that I'd use from that perspective.
But these West Londoners who are saying that, they must be like some advanced academic intellectuals to know that word. Is that right?
I mean, that's the thing, right? Like these knowledges exist everywhere, don't they? Right? Like these knowledges exist everywhere. And I think the first time I heard the word comprador, I must have been like maybe 20. It was undergrad, uni, right? First time I ever heard of it. But I knew what it was, right? Because I'd known what a coon is. I'd known what a coconut is. The word comprador just gave me a nice academic word for it. You know what I mean? That I can use in certain circles. But the knowledge exists.
Is it really that prominent of like a cultural understanding for black people?
I mean, I'd say in like post-colonial, decolonial circles, I've seen it used a lot, but also there's valid critiques that, these circles are a bit esoteric, right? Like a lot of these terms get used when actually we can use a lot simpler terminology that everyone understands and everyone actually uses in real day-to-day life. And really, this is what matters, right? We need words and theories and understandings and ideas that people actually know and people actually use. Because what is the point of knowledge if it's not going to be used, right? What's the point of knowledge if it's just to use in elite discourse, right? Like,
so you're saying that there's a black outside and a white inside?
Yeah, like a coconut, like an actual coconut.
It's super fascinating to me because the people who are identifying others as coconuts, they clearly understand the contradictions between, say, black and white people or the struggle against white supremacy. And to hear that it's suggested that it's somewhat common is actually really surprising to me, to be honest. But obviously it's great. So, anything else to add on, or do you want to share your second point?
Yeah, I mean, it's a racial capitalist critique, right? I think, it's recognizing that in racially colonized societies, whiteness is power. And whiteness is also can be economic power, not always, obviously, but especially we see this these terms used a lot more in America, where that distinction is a lot more pronounced. I think, but also that's another problem. Britain is like a little America, right? Like we borrow a lot from the US, where it might not perhaps fit into this society as neatly. But yeah, the second perspective that I was gonna go from was West African perspective. So I mean, Fanon covers a lot of this, right? Like the national bourgeoisie, or Robinson talks about in Black Marxism the native petty bourgeoisie. They were the native petty bourgeoisie were quite literally by function and by intention a comprador class. That was the whole point of them. They were meant to perhaps lessen the costs of imperial extraction by having locals who aren't white, right? Like it costs a lot more. If you're an imperialist, it costs a lot more to have a white colonist trained in a metropole and sent out to do whatever bureaucracy or whatever function needs to be done, it costs a lot more to do that than to perhaps train someone who's maybe mixed race or maybe is just fully Black African. To train them to do the same job, right? To play the same role, to perform the same functions. You can cut costs by doing that. So, the whole purpose of the native petty bourgeoisie was to facilitate imperial extraction. They were a comprador class by design of the slavery system and the colonial system in the New World. And we see the same on the African continent. We see the same in West Africa. We see these elites, these local elites, this native petty bourgeoisie, who are given their power, they are given their roles, they're given their training, they're given their education, they're given everything that they have by the Western finance capital that intends for them roles as imperial bureaucrats or middlemen or, like professional, I don't know, civil servants or whatever, right? Like various jobs that facilitate the exploitation of local labor, the exploitation of local lands, and the expropriation of that capital and its export to the imperial core. So yeah, there's a strong parallel there between the African context and the New World. We see a lot of similarities with a native petty bourgeoisie reared for that purpose.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned something super important, which is language and like how people recognize that. I think I also learned the word comprador maybe like, I don't know, like 3 years ago when I was also in my undergrad. But I recognized compradors just with, different language, and people recognize compradors, like you said, with a different term. And so if I go to a Palestinian, I'm like, who's the traitor? I mean, besides the Zionists are not traitors, they're colonizers, but who's the traitor? They're going to be like, okay, it's Fatah, it's the Palestinian Authority, it's Mahmoud Abbas, it's the people enacting settler colonial violence on behalf of the colonizers in Palestine. So because I knew we were recording this today, I was like, let me review like my quotations from Chairman Mao just to brush up on my language, because I want to be prepared. But you're right that these things can just be explained with like the simplest terms ever. It's a class that is not interested in liberation from colonialism, from settler colonialism or imperialism. It's a class that's counter-revolutionary, a class that's going to stand in the way of the liberation of not just, native indigenous people from colonialism and imperialism, but also the liberation of the working class from being exploited, from having their labor exploited, from also having, like you said, the fruits of their labor expropriated and sent over to other people who are funding their exploitation also indirectly or directly to use for very cheap. So yeah, I think like it's important for us to remember that like people know what these things mean. Maybe not necessarily with the same vocabulary, but the masses do know what a traitor is, and the masses can recognize what that is, maybe subconsciously. And then, as you build up your revolutionary consciousness, as you start becoming politically engaged, that's when you can like point it out, and you can even maybe start to understand it more deeply inside and more consciously, and put words to it, and start to like to be able to recognize how the comprador class functions and how.
Yeah, amazingly well said, both of you so far. If I was to think about the comprador class, like obviously as a Marxist, we think of like class consciousness, and consciousness is a huge part of that. Like knowing your role in society, so to speak, like just knowing that you're just a worker, meaning you're just going to have to sell your labour to a capitalist. The banking class just think, fuck everybody else, just make money. And the ruling class, their consciousness tells them that they're fucking born to rule us all. But under Marxism, class analysis is determined by one's relationship to the means of production, whether you own it, whether you don't own it. So when it comes to the comprador class, as it is a class, I do wonder whether the relationship is not so much about the means of production, but the mode of colonization and their relation to that mode. They themselves could be a mode in of itself of colonialism, as that's the labour they're putting out, just as a machine gun puts out fucking rifle rounds.
No, you're completely correct. I think you're completely correct. And like, I think I like that. You know what I mean? I like that, I guess, analysis of, okay, looking at a class, but not only through its relationship to capital, but also its function, the function that it serves. I like that, especially with that you gave of, landlords and, the fact that the monarch just couldn't occupy every single castle, right? And so, the monarch had to rule through this class of people underneath the monarch who performed a lot of the same functions and maintained ruling class hegemony. I like that because it made me think like, yeah, these are compradorial functions, right? These are basically compradorial functions, but this isn't really you can't really call them a compradorial class because it's still within Europe and they're not really performing colonial functions. But also, I was going to ask you on that, like, could we not look at it in a similar way? Like in the UK, for example, I wouldn't use colonial as a word at all, but there's almost a colonial relationship that a lot of other places within the UK have with London, right? With the capital, especially Wales, especially Scotland, especially the north of England. We see relations of underdevelopment, not to the extent that we've seen, elsewhere in the world, but we see a lot of similarities. And I think to some extent, could we not stretch the term, right? Like, could it not be stretched depending on the context that we're looking at? I think the problem with one definition is that it just won't. It might not catch everything. You know what I mean? It might not catch everything that can be caught. Do you get what I'm saying? Whereas, like, if we accept that perhaps it's less about the relation to capital, more about the function that's being played, then we can see the function existing, not only in feudal England, but also in Palestine, also throughout the African continent, also in Latin America, like also in China as well. We see the same compradorial function being performed everywhere in the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. You want to say something or should I?
Thanks. I'm just going to share more thoughts because I'm trying to genuinely gain a better grasp of the understanding of a comprador class. But to me, if you look at Mao's quote on it and just take that word for word, that doesn't truly encompass everybody who is behaving like the comprador class. And in fact, it brings out the contradictions of traditional Marxism in that nobody's analysing class anymore. They're just turning back to these pages. Personally, to me, even somebody who you would class as the working class in the imperial core, a proletariat, well, if that same corporation that the imperial working class was working at opened up shop in somewhere that was actively being colonised, would the workers there not actually be comprador class? They're complicit in this ongoing colonisation effort. So these are some of the things that I think about and struggle with, and I'm happy to listen more.
I agree that we shouldn't be super dogmatic and static about our definitions, and this is why it's important to not just read Marx, Engels, and Lenin. We should also, read Walter Rodney, Decolonial Marxism. That's an extremely important book that I think every Marxist who, even vaguely cares about the global South, which they should read and should engage with. This is why we should read George Jackson, like you mentioned. This is why we should draw all these parallels between the comprador class on colonized land and the pig class also on colonized land, at least here in Turtle Island and also in the UK, and their relation to, what was the word used, Shabi? Yeah, monopoly of violence. Okay. Yeah, so we need to also draw these parallels and understand how, even though the pig class, these the cops, the pigs are not necessarily part of the bourgeoisie. Technically, they don't own the modes of production. Technically, they're part of the proletariat, but they're class traitors. They're traitors to the working class and to the proletariat. And so their relation to that monopoly of violence is they're not the victims of it. They enact it. They carry it out. And this is why, we should engage with all of these works that take Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism, Marxism, Leninism, and also Engels' work, and sort of build on it, like Mao and George Jackson and Walter Rodney. If anyone should read anything, I would say like Decolonial Marxism is an essential text. And also I have it here, The Strategy for the Liberation of Palestine. You can see I really like it.
Wow.
Yeah. My definition of the Comprador class would be counter-revolutionary section of the national bourgeoisie that is not interested in any form of liberation from settler colonialism and imperialism, and betrays the interest of their people and betrays their work for liberation for class and social interests.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Amazing.
I agree.
That was pretty much
I think that
word
you
for
also
word
just
what, like,
quoted
the
pretty much
Marxists would
exactly
use,
how Marxists
but like the
would quote
Marxists,
the
like I
Comprador
said,
class.
Marx or Lenin
However,
didn't
something I
write about it,
find
or at least I
funny
haven't been
and
able to
sad
find
is I
anything where
could
they
not
have
find
wrote
anything
about
to
it.
do with
I think that
Marx
this
or
did
Lenin
emerge
talk
from
about the
black
Comprador class.
radicals.
I do believe that the Comprador class was contributed to Marxism by the black radical traditionalists and Palestinians, people who were seeing these subjects in their lands during colonial efforts. I think it's important that we recognise that. I'm also torn between the Comprador class because if you just look at the example that is the national bourgeoisie selling out to the colonialists, well, they can't be class traitors, but there's definitely compradors who are and are given a monopoly of violence by the state.
They're already part of the bourgeoisie, and so like the native bourgeoisie, and so I guess in that sense they're not class traitors, but it's important to like make these connections, you know, to like draw these similarities, and that's how we understand that, you know, this is not just an issue isolated to Palestine and the Palestinian Authority. Like, no, this issue also exists on the African continent. It also exists with like racialized people here on Turtle Island, with the pig class on Turtle Island in UK and Australia, New Zealand, you know, all of these people who are enforcing and propagating that monopoly of violence, to use your terminology.
Amazing, yeah. I use the term monopoly of violence again just to try and instill in people's mind that, you know, nearly everything that people do, they're like coerced into giving the consent, and it's either outright violence or it's political, and like politics is just war without the bloodshed. So we're constantly steered and made to do things and coerced, should I say, and to do things that we wouldn't ordinarily do, but sometimes it's more blatant. So Mao says the landlord class and the comprador class is in economically backward and semi-colonial China. The landlord class and the comprador class are wholly appendages of the international bourgeoisie, dependent upon imperialism for their survival and growth. These classes represent the most backward and most reactionary relations of production in China and hinder the development of their productive forces. Their existence is utterly incompatible with the aims of the Chinese Revolution. The big landlord and big comprador classes in particular always side with imperialism and constitute an extreme counter-revolutionary group. So just like he's basically categorizing compradors in with landlords, you know, just parasites on all the people, and just incompatible with the values of the Chinese Revolution, as you can imagine. But also saying that it hinders her productive forces as well. So if you're producing all kinds or exporting all the time and then you're not growing much yourself, on for none. There's been highly academic studies in Western prestigious universities to understand the comprador class by applying revolutionary finance interferences and theories about colonial legacy and its practitioners, the comprador. When I was Googling it, like I was trying to find a direct quote from Fanon on the Comprador class, but I mean, like, there's so many university papers that are using Fanon's definition of the Comprador class to analyze this, to analyze that, and then analyze Fanon and things. But like one thing that I did find that Fanon actually said was pretty potent, And although it's a small sentence, I think it should sum it up what he meant. So, the black skin on these compradors was masked by their complicity with the values of the white colonial powers. I think that's a more politically correct term of what you said, Malik.
Yeah, I think yeah, no, and I cited that book as well, Black Skin, White Masks. Like, he looks at a lot of the psychological impact that I guess this compradorial function has on these petty bourgeois individuals, right? Like, there's a psychological impact on them too. Like, capitalism impacts us all psychologically, it impacts our consciousness, and I would recommend that as a text as well. It's an interesting one for sure.
Wow.
Yeah, and the wretched of the earth also, even though it's not specifically about the Comprador Class, but I do think it's an essential text from Fanon.
Definitely.
I do find it super curious, and I would love it if anybody could tell me if Marx or Lenin did talk about the Comprador Class. Don't believe they did. Obviously, they were early on in the game, but I think the closest that they did come to it was talking about the labour aristocracy. But obviously, labour aristocrats are not the same as the Comprador Class, because it's the aristocrats in the West that even drawn the borders for native compradors to emerge in colonized places in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
But obviously, I believe that the Comprador Class are the ones who are physically, psychologically, socially, culturally maintaining the borders that the West wants or want to create.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, even though they don't, or even if they don't, to my knowledge, sort of mention it in the way that Mao does, for example, or Fanon, they do talk about reactionaries. They do talk about revisionists, and they talk about opportunists. And so that's why our understanding of the Comprador Class developed also from Marxism-Leninism. So even though they don't sort of say it in the terms that me or Malik kind of explained for our understanding of what's happening in Palestine and West Africa, like, they do talk about reactionaries, they do talk about working class traitors, they do talk about opportunism and dogmatism also. So I think all of these are also like essential things that would like supplement our understanding, or even maybe like be a foundation for our understanding of the Comprador Class when it comes to colonized land.
Tara, can I just ask you this question straight up, because I did touch on it earlier and I'd love to know your thoughts. Because if you think about the Palestinian Authority, they've got to be Comprador Class, haven't they? I mean, they're not national bourgeoisie selling the country out to colonialists, but the people just living next door to other people who grew up in the same area as them. They're not particularly affluent, they could have been poor, but they'll arrest and kidnap and their own people whilst working with the colonizer Israel. So how are those people, like the people of the Palestinian Authority, not Comprador Class?
The thing about the Palestinian Authority and the people that work for the Palestinian Authority and sort of like enact their violence, or the way that I understand it, but after being like extremely angry and emotional, like you are, about the Palestinian Authority, and you know how horrible, like, you know, just the most awful traitors to ever exist, you know, for Palestine. I'm gonna mention Marx again, which, you know, I just can't help but think of like his writing on human nature and human capacity. And so he writes, and I'm paraphrasing for sure, but he writes about how sometimes human capacity can trump all forms of, you know, morality or ethics or empathy or sympathy or whatever, because class and social interests are just at the core of what some people are seeking. So that's one way of understanding it. Another way of understanding it is some people are just super indoctrinated and they sort of end up there. But to be honest, when it comes to Palestine, I don't think I think that's a negligible minority. I think that the people who are indoctrinated into the PA state apparatus are very much a negligible minority because, like you said, like, you know, Palestinians live under occupation. Like this is their life. They, especially in Jerusalem and the West Bank, that are under military occupation. I mean, also in the 1948 occupied territories that are known as, you know, so-called Israel. Those territories are also obviously occupied. Like the Palestinians, they're also living under occupation. They wake up every day and see quote unquote Israeli citizens just living their life, you know. Also, not but also in Jerusalem and the West Bank and Gaza, like this is your daily life. Like there are IOF soldiers everywhere. There's checkpoints, 700-kilometer long apartheid wall that's 8 meters high and has, you know, soldiers with machine guns on like towers. This is where, like, I think it's really essential to understand human capacity for violence and also for being able to undertake the violence of the colonizer and just, you know, put it back out towards your own people. And the way that I understand it is through class relations. There's also another dimension, which is working class Palestinians that are working, you know, administrative jobs for the Palestinian Authority. Similar, I guess, to how, like, someone who, like, I don't know, someone would be working like a government job for the American government, like just, you know, a rank and file sort of regular job in administration. Like, I'm not saying a member of the Congress, I'm saying like
Civil service and anything like that.
yeah, like a civil servant, something like that. Those people are working class people that need to make a living like the rest of us, right? But for me as a Palestinian, it's really hard for me to like empathize with anyone who's finding a source of income from Palestinian Authority and like its state apparatuses, whether it's, you know, the ministry of whatever or any other government job. Then again, I am a Palestinian in the diaspora. I don't wake up every day and I'm like faced with all of these, you know, acute representations of colonial violence and IOF soldiers and everything like that. And so I can't really completely understand what's going on there for working class people who are, you know, choosing to go down this route. But that's, I think, maybe like one of my flaws. And if I can do some self-criticism here, I need to, I think, work on understanding why that happens. You know, this is why reading Black Skin, White Masks is really important, because the psychology of what happens is something that Fanon, who, not, I don't know why not many people mention, is a physician. Like, he's a psychiatrist and really understands that stuff, writes about. And so this is someone that we should look to for sure.
For sure, definitely. And like, I want to add to that. Like, I should probably reread Wretched of the Earth, because the first time I read it, I think I just a lot went through here, went straight out there. But I think there, if I remember correctly, there are case studies at the end where he's referring to particular patients he's spoken to, and you know, all of the, I guess, psychological disorders have been instilled within them as a result of, you know, colonization in the Algerian Civil War. And I'm bringing this up because I remember there was a particular group there. I think they're called the Harkis. And in Algeria, they were quite literally the best example you get of a Comprador class. They were Algerians who fought on the side of France during the Algerian Civil War. I read up on them because I think I was interested in a massacre that happened afterwards, because there was a lot of revenge that said befell them after the end of the war, and I was just trying to learn more about, you know, like why this class existed. You know what I mean? Why these Algerians fought against other Algerians? Why these Algerians fought for the continuation of colonization? And you know, if you know anything about French colonialism in Algeria, it was particularly nasty, particularly brutal, particularly genocidal. Like it was colonization in, you know, one of its more ugly, more overtly violent forms. And despite that, despite this very naked violence, they still sided with the French. And I wanted to learn more about them, and I would definitely encourage others to, read up on the Harkeys as a particular Comprador class. But the reason why I bring them up is because, again, despite seeing this very clear, obvious violence, they still side with the oppressor. And so there has to be something more than just class interest here, right? There has to be something more than just money here, because I'm sorry, but how can you see your own being butchered? How can you see lynching, right? How can you see the sheer brutal violence and side with it for money? I'm sorry, but there has to be more than money, right? Like it just has to be more than money.
Mm.
So it's very interesting in that regard, Yeah, that's what I wanted to add to that.
That's
Yeah.
come on, Tara.
Yeah, you reminded me of a Palestinian traitor of the highest degree. This is someone who living in the West Bank, and his father was a resistance leader, and he was spying for the occupation. He was spying for the Zionist entity, and he ended up writing a book called Son of Hamas, where he sort of spoke about his experience. Of course, from a Zionist perspective, he was like, I was the son of a resistance leader who was so horrible and bad and whatever, and now I'm safe and sound with, in parentheses, with my millions, living in whichever country, but his father is in prison, still in prison, because of his son's actions, because of his son's spying on behalf of the Zionist entity. And so this is a degree of like you said, a degree of I don't know what, that I just cannot understand. It's really difficult to understand, and really difficult to like try in your head to sort of find a rationale for it. That's not just money, and that's not just class interests.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great points, both of you. Thanks so much. Sarah, bless you for your self-critique. I'm sure it's not warranted.
Thank you so much. I super appreciate it. I've learned so much. I'm sure all of our listeners have. What's important is, obviously, if you're new to politics or whatever, and you're new listening to stuff like this, you just need to realise, if you're not being an instrument to humanity's emancipation, I can guarantee you're being an instrument to its servitude. That's how much power the state has over us, the ruling class. It's not even just one state, it's like every single bourgeois dictatorship on the fucking planet would all collaborate with each other. Fuck. If we had a revolution tomorrow, fucking United States, Germany, NATO and all that, would fucking invade England, even though the people just wanted to be free.
I don't think you're wrong. I think as long as we are not conscious, and we're not like politically engaged, that we are going to, unless we do engage with these contradictions, and we do engage with our role, whether we're part of the bourgeoisie or we're part of the so-called like pig class or whatever, or we're just complacent people, going through life, then we are instruments. And so this is why it's so important to allow yourself to have that political sort of awakening, like achieving that consciousness of realizing, first of all, who you are in relation to others, in relation to the world, in relation to the imperial core, and also what those other things that I mentioned are in relation to you, and how that set of relationships work. That's how I think that's how you kind of stop being like a complacent instrument.
Yeah.
No, 100%. Like I think actually I'd even take that as the opportunity to plug Rev Lumpen Radio, even, because I think what stops us being instruments is information like this, conversations like this, propaganda, ideas. These ideas being discussed and published and shared with people. This is what stops us being instruments, because we are bombarded by bourgeois cultural hegemony. We are bombarded by white supremacist imperialist cultural hegemony. We are bombarded by these ideas everywhere, in all the TV shows we watch, in our films, in school, university, at work, in our conversations with people. when, you know, just everything, every day, everything, it's all around us, it's everywhere. We are bombarded with this. And so we need that counter-hegemonic information. We have Lumpen radio, you know, we need these conversations, we need these ideas out there, because if we're so heavily bombarded by, you know, this bourgeois propaganda on this one side, we need that other side. We need that counterbalance to tell us the truth, right? To tell us the reality, which is that we are instruments. We need this information to stop being instruments. That's why I'm saying, like, this is what makes this conversation important, and all the other conversations on your platform equally important.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much.
You're so nice. You're so honest and true, but you're also so nice.
It's not nice.
Honestly, it's extremely difficult for me sometimes, because it's
not nice telling people that they're just instruments and
going
things.
out
But
and being
like
one of the
you
only
say,
people
even if you're looking like, you know, Marx and
to
that,
say that we need to
they
do
say
more,
they say nasty shit about the people. Do you know what I mean?
It's
and
genuinely unpleasant telling people,
it is
like,
what it is,
dehumanizing them and telling them that they're just mere instruments.
So,
you know
so
what I mean?
like,
I'm trying to use language that's effective, and
you know, you gotta
catches
agitate in that, and it's shit being,
it's
shit like trying to be agitating the
podcast really is
most,
super important
because
historically, I
you
believe.
rustle more feathers
And
than
despite
you
its
have to. I
importance,
mean,
again,
I guess it
sometimes
could
it's still
just be a
struggle
lot
to work
more
it, because
popular
I'm
and
highly
podcast
uneducated,
and work with all the other
social
podcasts
scum.
and just
So,
have this like
it's tough facing that and
collaborative
putting it out
fucking
there.
content producer kind
However,
of shit.
this is
But
a resource
I'm
that
just
a lot
glad
of
that people
do use,
recognise
and
that
it's also going to be a resource that's going to continue to be used when I am imprisoned, which I do expect would last for a number of years. I'm going to have other hosts on, other guests, and we're going to carry on what this podcast is all about, and what every other Imperial Core podcast is not about. If you're a listener and you know that you're on the same wavelength with us, and you've got something you feel is super important for us to talk about, please come on. Just message me on Instagram, and then I'll phone you back, and then we can discuss. Failing that, if you just love what we do, please support us on Patreon at patreon.com/lumpenpodcast. Like and share all of our stuff on social media, increase the reach. But back to our honourable guests. Tara, I think this is your favourite bit of the podcast, isn't it? Do you want to just tell us all your plugs, where people can find you and support and follow your work? And then Malik, please.
Oh, I hate that part. Plug my stuff. Well, first, it's not my stuff per se, but I want to plug GMAC, Gaza Mutual Aid Collective, on Twitter and Instagram. Gaza Mutual Aid, that's the username for both Twitter and Instagram, and you can subscribe to the Patreon, become a recurring donor to materially help our people on the ground. As far as my stuff per se, there's my Twitter. It's Tara XRH, and my Instagram, I forgot what username I'm using now, but it's linked in my Twitter bio. But yeah, I'm not gonna do any more plugging.
Appreciate that. I know that was probably the hardest bit out of the episode.
Yeah, well, it's Malik's turn now, so.
No, I hate this part. I always hate the self plugs. Yeah, I guess if I have to, then Afro Propaganda. That's my Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. Yeah, Afro Propaganda. My personal Twitter is Anglo Senegalese, but there I just chat shit. So I would not recommend my personal Twitter. On Anglo Senegalese, you will find, hopefully soon enough, 1,000 quotes. I think I'm on 920 something now. But those are quotations from just Africans of the continent and the diaspora. George Jackson, who was mentioned earlier, he's up on there, as well as Tupac Shakur, Malcolm X, Assata Shakur, Kwame Nkrumah, Nelson Mandela, Chris Hani, Julius Nyeri, just to name a few. Hopefully we'll get to 1,000, and then I can look towards doing something else, I guess. Give that a follow, give that love, and thanks for having us on the platform.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Once upon a time, in an obscure part of the Milky Way galaxy, there was a spinning ball of water and rock, ruled by the forces of evil. The devil himself, proud of the magnificent achievements of his children, decided to call a special banquet for the greatest thieves in all the land. He sent invites to thousands of the greatest murderers, rapists, and general assorted scum inviting them to attend his palace at the dawn of the new moon. Each thief would be given a chance to stake his claim as the greatest messenger of murder upon the planet, and the devil himself would then decide who should be crowned king. After many days of deliberating, all of the petty thieves, such as street criminals, have been found far short of the required level of wickedness, and there were just 4 sets of thieves left in the competition. They were the monarchs of empire, a cartel of bankers, the heads of religious orders, and the third world dictators. Each set of thieves appointed a spokesman to give his case to the devil. We have recorded these events for posterity. Listen. Okay. Yo. First up was the thief with the worst reputation, dictator of the third world nation. He looked the devil in the eyes, he spoke in an oh so serious tone. Dear Mr. Devil, I am the greatest thief that ever has been on earth. Please tell me who else, more than me, personifies your work. Came to power in a military coup. I murdered the elected president. He wanted to use the resources of our country for our people's benefit. I proved the masters in the West, I could kill my own people as well as the best. So I took over the so-called independent country when the foreigners left. Sent squads of death for those who would suggest in power should be the ones they elect. Erected a statue of the great man that raped our mothers, stole our lands. That's how little self-respect I have. Don't fight slavery, it makes me glad. Account in Switzerland, Rolls Royce, murder and rape cause I want new toys. Don't want a portion, a whole fortune. With that profit was a little bit of torture. Even outlawed my indigenous culture and language and history, and taught our people to only worship colonizers, and of course, me.
It's the banquet of the thief. Come dine with me. It's the banquet of the thief.
The devil was so impressed with this wonderful man, you almost ejaculated on his hands. But the monarch of the empire said, excuse me, Mr. Devil, I'd like to speak if I may. Who do you think trained this amateur dictator to behave this way? Yeah, I'm sure before I came along, his country was far from heaven. But look at the carnage I've caused all over the earth. It's got to be the work of the devil. Countless deaths, mass enslavement, deliberate starvation of whole nations. The dictator tries his best, but looking at me, he's just an imitation. Who do you think pays his wages? He would love to be trading places, cause I've been doing this thing on the roads way back since the middle of ages. Everybody knows he's a criminal element. They think I'm democratic and benevolent, and that shows that I'm really devilish, cause people think I'm heaven sent. I couldn't care about democracy. You all know no one elected me. The people love me despite my crimes. Sucker MCs wanna bite my shine. So bling and out of control, you would vomit. Don't even touch dough, but my face is on it.
It's the banquet of the thieves. The banquet of the thieves.
I'm a pervert, using the cloak of the clergy, yes, I'm a pervert, using the cloak. I'm a despicable character. I use my position of authority and spiritual reverence. I'm a despicable character. Mr. Devil, allow me to speak. All the religious leaders that leech in the word of creeps, I'm initiated, take people's faith and I dissipate it with false promises. Holler oratory, don't need a gun, it's daylight robbery. Dear Mr. Devil, I thought you would like it. I use the faith in God to keep them blinded. On a nice voice, read them a book, and they believe that I'm not a crook. Tell them God will repay them in the neck. They give me their life savings so I can buy jets. All the reports about child sex, none of us have ever gone jail yet. The system of stealing, so appealing, convinces the victims that life has meaning. Monarchs boast about conquest, but needed my blessings to get it done. And all of the dictators use my books, therefore they are just my sons.
The devil was sure this was the winner and was just about to put an end to the dinner. But then the man from the banking cartel stepped up and said, I think I'm the biggest sinner. All of those three depend on me. All they ever do is defending me, cause I paid for all of the things they have, of course, and the life that they lead. Paid for the guns, bombs and the tanks. That's why you see there is always more. I turn science, basic appliance into a client of weapon of war. Paid for monarchies, armed robberies. I make monopolies out of property. Never shot a gun nor kill anyone myself, but billions die cause of me. Who needs a threat? I make a debt out of thin air. Just sit back and collect every single day whatever they say. The people need me just to connect, yet none of them knows what I look like. Yet all of them spend my money to look nice. They want more, no one's pure. I hold the keys to every single door. Sell sex and drugs, profit and lies, earth and skies. I even sell life, I even sell freedom for the right price. They're not smart enough to ask me nice. So Mr. Devil, give me the medal, don't be biased. If you don't give it to me, I'll just buy it.
time